One significant legacy of Awolowo's free primary education scheme is that it enrolled more girls than boys. On January 7, 1955, the Premier of the Western region of Nigeria, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, announced a free and compulsory primary education scheme for every child of school-going age. As the leader of the Action Group Party, Awolowo believed that education was the foundation of nation building, the instrument by which the chains of poverty and ignorance could be broken. On January 17, 1955, the scheme was launched. Children poured into classrooms in numbers never seen before. Enrollment jumped from more than 400,000 in 1954 to over 800,000 in 1955. And by 1960, over a million pupils were in school. Teachers were recruited en masse. New classrooms sprang up in towns and villages, and education, once a privilege of the few, became the rights of the many. Interestingly, 70 years later, the program remains contested. Chief Awolowo's supporters view it as his greatest legacy, while his critics dismiss it as an over-ambitious political stunt that crippled regional finances and lowered the quality of learning. So, was Awolowo's 1955 free primary education scheme a scam? Or was it an ambitious gamble that changed the course of Nigeria's history? Let's find out. In the 1950s, Nigeria was still under British colonial rule, but constitutional reforms had granted the regions, North, East, and West, a significant degree of autonomy. Each region was free to pursue its development agenda, with premiers emerging as powerful political figures. The Western region, dominated by the Yoruba ethnic group, was economically prosperous compared to other regions, largely because of cocoa exports. The government's coffers were healthy, and there was optimism that wealth could be channeled into modernization projects. Obafemi Awolowo, a lawyer, nationalist, and intellectual, believed that education was the cornerstone of nation building. To him, a self-reliant Nigeria could only emerge if its citizens were educated, not just in elite secondary schools, but across all levels. He argued that the colonial education system had created a narrow class of clerks and administrators, leaving the majority of Nigerians in illiteracy. Awolowo's political philosophy, rooted in democratic socialism, placed universal education at the heart of social justice and development. Thus, when his Action Group Party came to power in 1952, he wasted little time in laying the groundwork for what became Africa's first mass-oriented free primary education scheme. It would be unfair to dismiss Awolowo's project without recognizing the extraordinary successes it achieved. For one, the rise in school enrollment was nothing short of dramatic. Within a single year, almost twice as many children were in school. By 1958, the figure had crossed a million mark, making the Western region the first in Nigeria and indeed in Africa to attempt education on such a scale. The free primary education program led to a big growth in schools across the Western region. The number of primary schools rose from 3,550 in 1952 to 6,450 by 1960. Secondary schools also increased sharply, from about 68 in 1955 to 700 in 1960. This was because the government believed primary and secondary education had to grow together. The number of pupils in school went up from about 429,000 in 1953 to 1.15 million in 1960, and enrollment rates rose from 35 to 63%. Interestingly, more girls began to attend school and their enrollment grew faster than that of boys. The program was very costly for the government, but it continued because it was popular and the ruling party was strongly committed to free education. In 1955, education alone took up 41% of the region's yearly spending, and by 1966, it still made up about 35%, with roughly 80% of that money going to primary education. This had far-reaching consequences. Literacy rates in the West soon outpaced those in the East and the North. By the early 1960s, the region boasted the highest literacy levels in the country, a distinction that gave its citizens a clear edge in civil service appointments, the professions, and emerging industries. For the first time, children of farmers, artisans, and marketwomen had access to the same opportunities as those of chiefs and merchants. The scheme also produced a new class of skilled manpower. Teachers, administrators, lawyers, doctors, journalists, and engineers began to emerge in larger numbers than ever before. Many of Nigeria's post-independence elites traced their first steps in education to Awolowo's classrooms. The policy, thus, created a generation of professionals who would later help steer the country in post-Civil War Nigeria. Perhaps the most profound success was its role in social mobility. Education became the ladder by which the poor could climb into the middle class. Countless stories emerged of children who, having begun their schooling in 1955, went on to become teachers, civil servants, or even cabinet ministers. Awolowo had promised to break the monopoly of privilege, and for many, he delivered. Politically too, the scheme was a masterstroke. It cemented the Action Group's reputation as a progressive party and ensured the loyalty of grateful parents. Even beyond politics, the scheme set a precedent. Although other regions did not immediately follow suit, by 1976, the federal military government of Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo would adopt a universal primary education program, explicitly borrowing from the Western region's example. By almost any measure, the scheme was a success, and yet, beneath the headlines of soaring enrollments and rising literacy, lay a host of serious problems that threatened to undo the very foundation of Awolowo's bold experiments. The free education scheme was celebrated in speeches and political rallies, but in practice, it faced formidable obstacles. The most pressing of these was finance. With enrollment nearly doubling overnight, the bill for classrooms, teachers, and supplies soon became unbearable. Cocoa revenues, which had sustained the prosperity of the Western region, began to falter as world prices dropped in the late 1950s. What had been intended as a liberating policy began to feel like a crushing financial burden. Then came the teacher crisis. Thousands of new teachers were required to staff the expanding schools, but most were barely qualified. Many were secondary school leavers with little or no training in pedagogy. While the numbers looked impressive on paper, the quality of instruction often left much to be desired. The classrooms themselves told a similar story. In urban centers and rural villages alike, children were squeezed into overcrowded spaces. For many critics, this was proof that Awolowo had pursued quantity over quality. The political dimension also drew sharp criticism. To Awolowo's opponents, the scheme was deliberately timed to boost the Action Group's popularity ahead of the 1956 elections. By offering what no other party had dared to promise, he secured the loyalty of the masses. Opposition voices that suggested modest fees to make the program sustainable were dismissed as enemies of the people. In the eyes of many, free education had become less an instrument of social upliftment and more of a tool of political propaganda. There were other structural problems as well. Dropout rates remained high, particularly in rural areas where children were often withdrawn to help on family farms. Also, only about 5,000 pupils, that is, 3 to 5% of primary school graduates, could get admission into secondary schools. By the early 1960s, the Western region was sliding into a fiscal crisis. Critics seized on this to argue that the scheme had become a reckless gamble, a populist promise that could never be sustained. Even as Awolowo's opponents sharpened their knives, millions of children continued to stream into school each morning, their slates and exercise books clutched tightly in their hands. For those children and their parents, whatever the shortcomings, the scheme was no scam. It was a lifeline. Whether Awolowo's 1955 free education scheme was a scam or a visionary strategy has remained one of the most enduring questions in Nigeria's political history. On one hand, critics have long argued that the project was less about the children of the Western region and more about the political ambition of its architect, Chief Obafemi Awolowo. On the other hand, admirers insist that it was one of the boldest reforms ever attempted in Africa, one whose effects outlived its teething troubles. Those who dismiss the policy as little more than a political gimmick often point to the poor planning that surrounded its launch. The Western government had underestimated both the cost and the scale of the project. Within months, the scheme had far exceeded its original budget, especially when the global prices of cocoa began to fall. To many, this suggested that the program had been rushed for political gain rather than carefully thought through. The timing did little to silence such suspicions. Coming just ahead of the 1956 regional elections, the scheme looked to some like a brilliant piece of political theater. Parents, grateful to see their children in school for the first time, rallied around the action group. Opposition parties, which suggested modest school fees to make the policy sustainable, were branded enemies of progress. To Awolowo's detractors, this proved that education had become a weapon of propaganda, a tool for consolidating power rather than a genuine attempt to uplift society. But to describe the scheme as a scam is to ignore the profound changes it unleashed. For the first time in Nigerian history, education became a right rather than a privilege. The farmer's child now sat in the same classroom as the traders or the chiefs. Literacy levels rose, social mobility improved, and an entire generation was given the tools to aspire beyond the boundaries of poverty. By the early 1960s, the Western region had the highest literacy rates in the country, a distinction it owed directly to Awolowo's policy. Every bold reform, defenders argue, comes with its birth pains. America's public school system in the 19th century was also criticized for overcrowding and poor standards. Yet, it laid the foundation for a literate industrial society. The same could be said of Awolowo's free education. It may have stumbled in execution, but it planted a seed whose harvest is still being reaped. Awolowo himself never denied the difficulties, yet in his view, the greater danger was to do nothing at all, to leave millions of children in the darkness of ignorance. Better to start imperfectly and improve over time than to delay until the ideal conditions appeared. In this light, the scheme was less a scam than a strategic gamble. It may have been politically useful, but it was also socially transformative. It may have drained the treasury, but it also enriched the human capital of the region. It may have been chaotic in the short run, but in the long run, it altered the trajectory of Nigerian education. Perhaps the truth lies not at either extreme, but somewhere in between. The 1955 free primary education scheme was at once a political weapon and a social revolution. It was both flawed and far-sighted, hasty and historic. To call it a scam is to belittle the opportunities it created. To call it flawless is to ignore the chaos it produced. It was, in the end, the kind of bold experiment that marks the difference between leaders who play safe and those who dare to gamble on history. Looking back, it is impossible to deny the transformative impact of Awolowo's 1955 free primary education scheme. It was not perfect, and in truth, it could hardly have been. No region in Africa at the time had attempted such a vast social experiment, and the challenges of finance, infrastructure, and manpower were inevitable. However, the results were profound. The Western region quickly became the most literate part of Nigeria, producing the teachers, doctors, engineers, journalists, and civil servants who would dominate the national stage for decades. The scheme also set the tone for Nigeria's wider educational policy. When the federal military government eventually introduced universal primary education in 1976, it was following the path Awolowo had carved 21 years earlier. Even today, whenever the idea of free and compulsory education is debated in Nigeria, Awolowo's initiative is invoked as both precedent and inspiration. Still, the criticisms linger. Was the scheme financially reckless? Yes. Did it sacrifice quality for quantity? Undoubtedly. Was it also a masterstroke of political calculation? Few would dispute that. However, to dismiss it as a scam would be to miss its deeper significance. Despite the chaos, millions of children who would never have seen the inside of a classroom were given the chance to learn, to dream, and to do. Awolowo's scheme was an attempt to revolutionize the West through education. Whether he succeeded remains open to debate, but his legacy endures not in the speeches of politicians or the pages of history books, but in the lives of those who carried slates into overcrowded classrooms and went on to change their world. So, was Awolowo's 1955 free primary education scheme a scam? Or was it the imperfect beginning of a revolution in African education? Can any bold social experiment ever escape the charge of failure when measured against its own ambitions? And perhaps the most important question of all, if Awolowo had not dared to implement that scheme in 1955, where would the children of the West and Nigeria itself be today?